Righto, here we go with another couple of questions that you guys have put in. I guess, again, just as a reminder, these are questions that are kind of big questions, but probably ones that would take a bit too long to actually do properly at youth, and maybe you want to have something that you can go back and look at again. So we're going to try and do them with these little videos, which hopefully will be helpful for you. So, first question today is, what does the Bible have to say about divorce? Which is a pretty massive question. It's a good question. I'm glad that you guys put it in. But it's one that we want to be careful when we try to answer. We want to be careful because it's very easy to say things that the Bible says about really sensitive issues that are very relevant to a lot of us. But when we do say things, we want to make sure we're actually being caring and loving towards people for whom it's not just ideas, but it's reality. It's the life that we live. And so we want to be careful. We want to be careful how we answer those questions. Just want to say that up front. Now, as we start to talk about what the Bible does say about divorce, I reckon a really important category that we need to have in our heads whenever we're talking about this kind of thing is that there are things that the Bible says about the ideal of the way that we want to live, but then there's the reality, the experience of what it looks like to live in a fallen world. Now, the ideal is if we were all perfect people living perfect lives, then this is what life would look like for us. Okay, so the ideal is that nobody's greedy and everybody will be generous and share, and therefore nobody will go in need. That's the ideal. The reality is that people are greedy and people don't share and people are corrupt and cheat, and therefore there are people who are hungry, there are people who are in need. So there's the ideal, but then there's the reality. We can't always live up to the ideal. That's the problem that we have because of sin, because the world is broken. When we talk about the fall, when we talk about Genesis 3 and sin, we're not just talking about the occasional bad thing that people do. The idea is that the entire world is affected by sin. The entire world is short from what it was meant to be when God made it and what it will be when Jesus comes again. So we don't always manage to live up to the ideal, but the good news of the gospel is not only does God save us from the brokenness of the world, but that God is capable of doing great good out of the mess that we make of the ideal. And I'm going to say that divorce ultimately was not the ideal, it's not the intent. And I think anyone who has lived through a divorce will tell you that probably wasn't the intent that they had, and that wasn't the ideal that they had for their life. It's not those things, but God can still do good things through the messiness of the brokenness in our life. Another example of that in the Bible, not about divorce, but about something else, is about Joseph. If you know the story of Joseph, he's one of Jacob's sons in Genesis, and he has a pretty messed up story. So basically, he's the second youngest or something like that, one of the last of 12 sons, and basically, he's a bit of a jerk. Right, so he kind of, in some ways, brings some of his story on himself. He's a really arrogant guy. God gives him these dreams that kind of make it sound like he's really important, and he goes and tells them to all of his brothers and his mum and dad, basically to say, I'm kind of a big deal, and you guys will be recognizing that one day. So that's what Joseph does. So basically, he's arrogant. His brothers don't take it too well, so they are violent. They grab him, they beat him, they throw him into a hole, and eventually they sell him into slavery. That's obviously pretty bad as well, as you can probably work out. And he ends up being a slave in Egypt, and by God's grace, he's able to kind of get promoted through the ranks, even though he's a slave. And eventually, there's this story of starvation over the whole land, and kind of, it's a big famine. People would have died as a result of this famine. People are desperate for food. And then at the end of the story, what happens is his brothers travel from Israel all the way to Egypt to go and buy bread, only to find that the person selling it to them is Joseph, who they thought was dead, basically because they'd killed him. And there's this great line in Genesis 50, verse 20, where Joseph says to them, "You intended this thing for evil, but God intended it for good. What he's saying, and what I think is really helpful for us, is that even though things weren't good in how it happened, right? There was a lot of bad stuff. There was arrogance, violence, slavery, starvation in the story. But God is able to do great good no matter what's happened before. Okay? So that's kind of the idea. We have the ideal, then we have the reality, and the gospel, the good news is that God can work in the middle of a messy reality to bring about good things. So, what does the Bible have to say about divorce? Well, obviously it's related to what the Bible has to say about marriage. Let's talk about the ideal of what the Bible has to say about marriage. So, the first place we read about marriage is in Genesis chapter 1, straight after God talks about creation and talks about having made people male and female. He goes on to say, for this reason, a man will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, right? That's the first reference to marriage in the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. That's the one that Jesus goes to when people come to ask him questions about marriage and about adultery and about divorce. He goes, well, what does the Bible say? And he goes back to Genesis 1 and says, kind of, this is the picture that the Bible gives of what marriage is supposed to look like. Right? So that's the ideal. And you see that in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. God makes Adam and God makes Eve. All of the rest of the story happens. And that's kind of good. It's good that they're in relationship. It's what God meant for them to be in. But we also know that the ideal of marriage, at least the ideal of marriage now, is that it's not eternal, right? So there's another story in Matthew chapter 22, right? So, and what I mean by that, when I say it's not eternal, I mean we're married, we get married now, but we're not going to be married in heaven to one another. And Jesus tells this story, or at least some people come to Jesus in Matthew chapter 22, and they say to him, right, they're trying to trick him. They're trying to say, okay, there's this woman, right? And she gets married, but her husband dies. They don't have any kids, so she marries his brother, but he dies, and it goes on and on and on. There's 7 brothers. Eventually, all 7 brothers have died. Eventually, then the woman dies as well, and these guys are trying to trick Jesus, and they say, well, when they all turn up at heaven, who's going to be married to who? Because she was married to all 7 of them. You know, that's going to be a pretty awkward kind of scenario, isn't it? So who are you going to go with for the rest of eternity? And the point that Jesus says is, well, you're wrong and you're stupid, because when we reach heaven, we won't be married in the way that we're like now, because marriage is something that's limited to earth now. So it's a good thing. It's part of God's good creation that he has given to us, but it's not eternal. So when we think about eternity with God, marriage to other people is not part of that picture. So marriage is good. Marriage is not meant to be eternal. That's the ideal. But then we have sin come into the picture as well. Sin messes everything up. Sin particularly messes relationships up. And if you go back and you read Genesis 3, what you notice is not just that rebelling against God and disobeying him is a bad thing. You read that as a consequence, relationships get messed up. Adam and Eve's relationship with God is messed up. They used to be really close to God, but because of sin, now they hide from God in Genesis chapter 3. And their relationship with each other is messed up. So where they had been really close and natural and easy in their relationship before, after the fall, now they start accusing each other of various things. So it kind of ruins their relationship as well. So it kind of follows from that, that one of the effects of sin in the world is that it just messes up and makes relationships with other people hard. Not just in marriage, it makes friendships hard, it makes family hard, it makes marriage hard. And so as a result, relationships don't always work the way that we intend them to do. So what we need is a solution to this problem. And the solution to that problem, unsurprisingly, because you're coming to a Christian youth group, is Jesus. So Ephesians 5 talks about marriage, and Paul there, who writes the letter to the Ephesians, you might remember we looked at this one last term. Paul speaks to the Ephesians and he says to them, he starts talking about husbands and wives and how they should care for each other and be gracious and kind and all of that kind of thing. And he finishes in that by saying that actually marriage just points us forward to the perfect relationship that one day we will have with Jesus. So Relationships are broken in the present, but one day they will be made right in Jesus. We will experience that kind of perfect relationship with Him. So that's the ideal. That's the reality, is that there are problems. What do we do now? The reality is a few things that we can say that the Bible says about marriage and divorce. One is, we still want to strive for the ideal, right? We don't just say, okay, the world's broken, so it doesn't really matter. We'll just do whatever, and God doesn't care. That's not really true. We still want to try to strive towards what the ideal is, but we recognize that sometimes, despite our best efforts, it's not always going to work out. So the first thing that we need to know is that whether our relationships and whether our marriage relationships are close to the ideal or a long way from the ideal, either way, we're still waiting for Jesus to fix them. None of us has the perfect relationships. None of us ever will until Jesus returns. Some of them might feel a bit easier than others. Some of them might feel like they're closer to the ideal than others. But none of them are going to be ideal until Jesus comes back. That's true for all of us. Doesn't matter whether you're married or divorced or anything else, or single for that matter. So we're waiting for Jesus to come and fix our relationships. Secondly, if you're single, it's really important that you build all of your relationships around Christ, making that focus on Him the most important thing within your relationships, because it's only going to be harder if you don't. And so often, I say that because so often Christians sort of will say things like, oh, I know that this relationship isn't really honoring to God, or I know that this person doesn't follow God, but we really like each other and we're really determined to make it work. Everyone is determined to make it work at the start, but the best chance that you can give yourself is to find someone that you're on the same page with faith-wise. So if you're single, work really hard to build your relationships around Jesus. Secondly, if you're married, then strive for the ideal no matter how hard it is, right? And this is a big difference from our world, our culture that we live in. Our culture will tell us, you know what, if marriage gets really, really hard, the best thing that you can do is just break it off. You'll be happier and then go and try and find a relationship with another person. That's not the intent. And what that does is just kind of reinforce for us the brokenness of relationships. So if you are married, give everything that you have towards making sure that you can work that relationship out, even if it's hard. Engage people to help you with that as well. It's not something that we should be trying to do alone. And if you're divorced, or if you have been divorced and are remarried, then look to honour Him now as best you can. Because I think that's the other big thing, isn't it? We can kind of feel as though, all right, the ideal is a good marriage. It didn't work. Therefore, we've somehow missed out. We've somehow fallen short of what we're meant to be. And you know what? It's not the ideal, but there are a heap of things in our life that are not the ideal. We don't reach the ideal in any part of our life. That doesn't mean that God gives up on us and abandons us. So if you or someone you know is divorced or gets divorced or has been divorced and remarried, it's kind of like, all right, that might not have been what was intended in the beginning, but you can't change the past, but you can change the future. You can work out where you are with God now, and you can work out how God's love can be at work in your circumstances going forward as well. So if someone you know finds himself in that position, the best advice you can give them is to try to build their relationships from here on in around Jesus. So there you go. There's a few things about the ideal, but also about the reality and about the fact that God's grace is bigger than anything else, and God's love is able to work in any circumstances. There you go. Bit of a long one, but a bit of a good question. If you have follow-up questions, don't forget to drop them into the SWAT question box. That's where questions go, and we can talk about those then. Thanks.